Hey, and welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're actually going to be looking at how we can actually use the combined framework in UIKit and SwiftUI and how we can apply this to some practical examples. So the first thing you're going to do is actually go onto my GitHub page with my YouTube resources, which I'll put a link for in the description box below. And essentially what you want to do is you want to basically download this. And then we basically want to use the folder here called Getting Started with Combine. You should see this folder here called Getting Started with Combine. All right, cool. So all you need to do is just open up the workspace, and then you should see a list of all the Xcode projects that we're going to be going through. So the first one that we're going to start on is Introduction to Functional Programming. So if you already know functional programming, you can actually skip this chapter and actually go to the next chapter, which is actually breaking down reactive programming. What we're going to do is we're actually going to start off with functional programming, and the reason why is because it's really important, because essentially Combine is actually built on top of these functional programming patterns. Now, if you're someone who has no idea what functional programming is, essentially what it is, it's a way for you to basically almost like group your functions together and almost like combine them together, so you basically can perform multiple actions in a chain. Now, so what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to look at some functional, programming methods that come with Swift, and we're not going to go through all of them because trust me, there's a lot of them. But essentially, we're going to go through some, and we're going to see how we can basically refactor the code that we have on the screen here. If you basically just open up the if you've opened up the workspace, if you just go to the first Xcode project here called Intro to Functional Programming. And then if you basically open up the playground, and like I said before previously, if you already know about functional programming, you can actually skip ahead to the next one where we actually break down reactive programming. But essentially what we have here is we basically have an array of items with some names in there, even put a Nigerian name in there representing. So we've also got a function in there called filter nils. So essentially what this function is going to do is it's going to basically remove any nils from this array and give us back an array with no nil values. So if I run this function now, we'll see that we basically get all the names back without any nil values, which is cool. But there's actually a way to basically do this using functional programming, and we don't have to write out all this logic ourselves. We can actually just let these functions and chain them and do it for us. So one way to actually do this is by using a function in functional programming called compact map. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to type out this function, and then we'll break down the syntax of it. So what we basically have here is we have our array of items, but we now have this function called compact map. And essentially what compact map does is it basically iterates through an array of objects, and it essentially removes any nils. So if there's any nil values, this function will actually remove it for us automatically. So if you just look at this and then compare it to what we wrote here, it's a lot cleaner because we don't actually have to write out all this boilerplate stuff. We can just basically use this function, and then we can actually chain on top of this function to change the original value, which is what we're going to do next. But before we do that, we basically got these curly braces here. Now, essentially, what this is doing is like a closure syntax. So we're basically saying that we want to basically run this without the parentheses. So we're using a closure syntax. And if you use the closure syntax on one line, like what we've done here, we basically get this thing called $0. And essentially what this means is it's basically the original value that you're iterating through. So what this is each object in the array that's actually going through. So it's basically going to go through each object in the array, and when it finds a nil, it won't return it back to you in the array. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this now and see what happens. And as you can see, we get the exact same result just by using this high order function. Now, what I want to do is I actually want to basically take this out of the array and actually format it with a list with separated commas. Now, as you can see, if we wanted to do that with this, we'd have to add in more code, which is what we don't want to do. We don't want this to get too big. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to see how we can actually chain functions. All right, cool. So now we've done that, what we've basically done here is we basically are using more functions to chain and basically change the original value. So we know about compact map, but now we have something called map. So what's the difference between these two? So essentially what map does is it basically creates an array of objects. So this doesn't actually care for nils. So if you wanted to basically map your data to a specific type, you can use map. So what we're basically doing here is we're basically using map to basically create an array of strings. So this basically takes out any nills, but at this point it's still actually an optional array. So we map it and basically almost like flatten it to an array of strings. So what this join will do is it'll actually combine the entire array of strings that are not optional and basically put a separator between each one, as you can see here. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to print this out. And then let's just run it. All right, cool. So as you can see, we've now basically got our names flattened into one string and they're all separated by these commas. All right, cool. So that was just like a brief introduction into functional programming. And if you want me to do a more detailed video, then let me know in the comment section below. But I'm also going to list some resources that I think are really handy for you to understand more about functional programming. And we're still going to go through more functions as well because we're using Combine. So let's jump to the next section where we actually talk about what is reactive programming. So when working with Combine, it basically brings forward a new concept that you may not be used to called reactive programming. Reactive programming is essentially a pattern where we basically have a object that listens to some sort of event, and when it receives a change or some sort of value, it basically reacts to it. So we basically make our UI react to changes. Now, when working with Combine, there's two main concepts that pretty much sum up all of reactive programming, and these are publishers and subscriptions. So publishers are what you use to basically, almost like I said before, to publish, emit an event, and subscription is when you basically listen to a change or an event being sent. So let's actually break this down with a really simple example. So if we look at our simple example, what we basically have here is we basically have a switch. So in our case, the switch is basically our publisher. So this is what we use to basically turn things on or off. So think about a switch in your house. Now, when you turn the switch on or off, it's basically sending that event, which is on or off. And then what happens, like I said, is it sends the event. And then once the event is sent, we basically can have a light bulb. So the light bulb would essentially be our subscription. So it basically listens to the event that we've sent, which is, you know, us toggling on our switch, and it basically changes based on this event. So obviously, if you switch the light on, then the light bulb will turn on, and if you switch the light bulb off, the light bulb will turn off. So it changes based on what is emitted. So what we're actually going to do now is we're actually going to go to the next chapter where we actually look at how we can actually use subscriptions and actually listen to changes and react to this. Our first example of, working with Combine, we're going to look at how we can use subscriptions and how Cancellables works. So this project here, we're actually going to basically build like a really simple timer. Now, in order to basically get onto this, in your workspace, you want to make sure that you're editing the files in subscriptions and Cancellables, and you want to make sure that the target you select matches as well, so subscription and Cancellables. Now, I've just run this on my machine now. And as you can see, you don't need to build any of the UI. I've already done it for you because we just want to focus on Combine. I got you like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how we can actually use Combine to basically create like a really simple timer. So let's do that now. So with Combine, the first thing we need to do is obviously import it. So let's do that now. And then if you just scroll all the way down, so just above the load view, we actually need to basically create a cancelable to basically hold our subscription. So I'm going to type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So why do we need to do this? So essentially with Combine, what actually happens is when you're basically creating subscriptions where you want to listen to changes, you need to store that somewhere. Now, if you don't store the subscription somewhere, what will actually happen is essentially it's just not going to work. So what we do here is we basically create a global variable to hold our subscription. So when our view controllers are live, our subscription doesn't actually get destroyed until we actually destroy it or it needs to be destroyed. So the next thing we need to do is actually write out the code to basically handle our timer logic. So I'm going to type this out. Cool. So that was a lot of typing. So let's break that down. So what we actually do is we basically store our timer in our subscription. So we, like I said before, we can keep it alive. But let's actually just walk through each function that we basically used and chained on top of each other. So what we basically here is we basically use the timer that comes with, Swift, and we basically use this function called publish. Now, this basically creates a publisher for the actual timer object itself. And we essentially say that every single 1 second that it should keep on going on the main thread within the common loop thread. So this is basically going to run this timer every single second on the main thread. And then what we're going to basically do here, it almost like connects the timer to our publisher so we can actually listen to the changes for the timer. And we basically got this function here called scan. So essentially what this scan is doing is it basically allows you to basically create a value and almost like change it. So in our case, what we're doing is we're basically going to scan from 0, and what this is going to do is actually go to increment it by 1. So this essentially is where we increment in our seconds by 1. So hence why it's called count. And then we use this function here called sync. So sync is when you want to basically get the final value out of the subscription. So there's two completion handlers here. So there's completion. So this completion is when the subscription has completely been killed and it's finished. And receive value is when the value within the subscription changes. So in our case, when the count changes, we're actually going to access it within this receive value here. And then we basically just print out a message to show what we're going to format the label with. And we just basically assign this label with how we formatted the seconds. In terms of this format, it's not something I wrote, so I actually put a reference where I just basically got this from Stack Overflow. So essentially, we just use this function to format the seconds into hours, minutes, and seconds. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're going to rerun this. So if I just stop this, if I just basically just run this subscriptions and cancellables on my device here, and then if I just hit the start button, you'll see now that our timer is updating and the label is being changed as well. All right, cool. But how do we get the stop button to actually stop the timer? Essentially, what we need to do is we basically need to essentially stop this subscription from running all the time. So in order to do that, it's fairly straightforward. All we need to do in here is that there's actually two ways of doing it. I'll show you the way that I prefer. So one way of doing it is we could basically use this. So we could basically set the subscription to 0. Now, the reason why we can set this subscription to 0 is because we defined it as an optional here. But I don't really like doing this, to be honest with you. So subscription, any cancellables actually comes with a function called cancel. So if we just say dot cancel, this essentially will basically stop our subscription, and this will actually stop. So you essentially just put that in stop timer and then just stop it and then run it again. So now we hit start. This is going to run every single second. And now if we hit stop, you'll see that it actually stops our subscription. And if we hit start again, it restarts. The next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to look at how we can actually combine subscriptions together and actually see how we can combine two publishers and subscribe to their changes. So let's look into that now. So in this part, we're basically going to look at how we can combine two publishers and basically change the value when we subscribe to it. So what you need to do here is you need to basically go to the Xcode project called Combining Subscriptions. Essentially, what we have here is we basically have two publishers. So we have one publisher, which is a optional array of strings, as you can see here with all the foods. And we've got another publisher here, which is an optional array of strings as well, with a bunch of names as well. So it's worth noting here the syntax. So essentially what we're basically saying here is that this is almost like a collection of objects that we're basically going to publish and listen to. And the type of this is this type here. So it's an array with optional strings in it. Now this keyword never basically means that there's no errors. So this can never fail. So hence why it's called never. And at the end, to turn this into a publisher, this array, we basically use the dot publisher annotation. Now obviously this is only available with combined, so if this is something you want to do in your own personal project, then you want to make sure that you import combine. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to basically just write out a bit of code and just show you how we can actually subscribe to these publishers and basically manipulate the values that we get back from it. So I'm just going to do this now. All right, cool. So essentially what we've done here is we basically got our people publisher and we basically combined it with our meals. So what's going to happen is that these two publishers are actually going to essentially, listen to each other. And then what we're going to do is we're basically going to grab the values from both of these published arrays. So in the completion, we basically just print out the completion subscription. But in receive value, you'll see something interesting. So essentially now we actually have access to person and meal. Now the order of this here is basically based on the order of the way that you combine the two publish arrays. So because we define people here first, that's the first one, and then we're then basically combining meals to it, which is the second one. You can see meal here. So now what we're going to do is we're basically going to listen to what these two publish arrays emit. So essentially when it goes through each values, it goes through this value, this value, this value, and so on and so forth. And we're basically going to just literally create our own custom string, which tells us what meal a person likes to eat. So let's just run this now and see what happens in the playground. Okay, cool. And as you can see here, we basically get all the people, so my name and all the foods that they like to eat. But there's two things here that's pretty interesting. So the first thing is that this actually printed out subscription finished. Now, why did it do that? Well, the reason why it's printed out subscription finished here is because it's actually finished going through every single value within the published sequence. So when it finishes going through everything, it will tell you, hey, I'm done. So at that point, the subscription doesn't need to be alive anymore. It's basically, you can basically, if it's still alive, you can basically get rid of it, or if it hasn't been disposed of, you can dispose of it. But the second thing is we actually do have a nil here. Now, obviously, this isn't the best because if you had this on a UI, you wouldn't want to show something empty. What we can actually do is we can actually use a functional programming function called filter to basically take out and not print out any values that have a nil. So I'm just going to type this out and then break it down. What we basically said here is we basically want to filter out any people and any meals that are nil. So this will actually basically return the array of people and meals where there's basically a value inside of it, so we won't get any nils. So let's actually run this now. And as you can see, Jack here doesn't appear because meals is actually nil, so it doesn't print out the value nil. Now, this is a valid way of doing it, but we probably could do this a better way. So a better way of actually handling all this, to be honest with you, would be to have a function that throws an error and basically tells us when something's gone wrong. So if something has gone wrong, we can handle it ourselves. That be either logging it or showing some sort of placeholder image or whatever it is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically type out a bit of code in terms of how we can handle the errors, and I basically have a function to basically validate that neither one of these are not nil. So let me just do that now. All right, cool. So let's just break this down a bit. So what we basically have here is we basically have an enum called person error. And essentially this is just our error for just handling, any of the errors that we want to, check for. One of the errors that we want to check for is empty data. So if there's any empty, so if there's any nils, then we'll basically throw this. And we basically just wrote an extension on our person error with a property called error description. And what that's going to do is if the case is empty data, then it's basically going to return this message here. We basically got this function here called validate. Now, what this function does is it basically validates the person and the meal that gets passed into it. And if everything's all good, then it basically returns a string message. So this is where we basically manipulate. This is where we're going to basically manipulate our two publish arrays and just return a message. Or else, if something goes wrong, then we're basically going to throw an error, and that error being that there's some empty data. So now that we've got all this set up, what we can actually do is rather than using filter, we can basically use a function called try map. And what try map's going to do is it's basically going to try and map the values. So try and change the values that we basically want to change to, which in our case is a string. And if it fails, then what it's going to do is actually going to throw an error and tell us what went wrong. Or if it was all good, then it will just carry on like you would with any other function like map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace filter. Right, cool. So now what we basically got here is we basically got our function here, try map, which is going to try and validate the person and the meal. And now in our receive value, we're not actually checking for two values, we're actually checking for the message. Now this message is what this function has mapped it to. So for us, it's mapped it to a string because this is what we return here. So we just basically print out that message. Now what we need to do in the completion is we basically need to actually handle the error where if something actually does go wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to just delete this line. And then because this completion is actually a result, we can actually use a switch statement on this. So let's do that now. Cool. So what we're actually basically doing here is we're basically matching to the possible result that we can get from our completion. So when the subscription has finished, it will basically print out finished. But if something goes wrong and it fails, it'll actually print out that it failed and why it failed. So we can actually try to cast it as our custom enum person error. But if it fails and it can't be cast as a person error, then we'll just basically default to the default error and the localized description. So what I'm going to do now is I'm basically going to run this and see what happens. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So as you can see, it basically does print out that, I enjoy burgers, Bob enjoys, and Toyo enjoys. But when it fails, it basically tells us that something failed. So it basically says that there was a nil value somewhere. So at this point here, if something went wrong, we can actually handle any errors that we wanted to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically fix this, and I'm actually going to change this to some other food. So let's just do that now, and you can do whatever meal you like. So I'm just gonna go to the emojis. I'm just gonna choose to add some bacon in. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna basically run this again. And as you can see now, it actually prints out everyone, and so it actually tells us that it's finished publishing or the emitting all the events and nothing has failed. So you can see here, if we just quickly just review it from top to bottom again, that we can easily combine two publishers. So two publishers that are doing two different actions. We can actually validate and actually change the value based on the result that we get back from these two publishers. And we can actually basically observe the value in receive value or handle whenever it's finished or failed. So next thing we want to do is we actually want to see how we can actually assign subscriptions to values so other values automatically update. And we're actually going to see how we can apply this in UIKit by assigning a value to a UI component. Okay, cool. So for the next section, we're actually going to look at how we can actually assign subscriptions to other values. So let's say you have a publisher where you basically emit a value. We're going to see how we can actually assign the new value to an existing value within a class, for example. Now, for this, you want to make sure that you're looking at the project called assigning subscriptions, and you want to make sure that the target is also selected as well. So what we basically have here is we basically have a class called levels manager, which basically has the user's level. And whenever this value changes, we're actually going to print out the user's level to the console. So what I essentially want to do is I basically want to change this value. So I want to basically publish a event to change this value. And whenever this value changes, I want to basically print it out into the console, like I said before. But what we're going to do is we're going to basically use a range so we can actually loop through this. So loop for a range of values and actually update this. All right, cool. So what we basically done here is essentially we basically create a initialization of our class levels manager, and we basically got this range. So this is basically just finding a collection of numbers from 0 to 100, and we basically got our subscription here within our cancelable. And then we basically get our range and we basically turn this range into a publisher. So what this is going to do now, because it's a publisher, is it basically going to go through every single value between 0 to 100. And we basically have this syntax here, which you may not have saw before. So what this is basically called is it's literally called key paths. So we're basically saying in the assign function within the levels manager, the value that gets emitted from this range, so 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 100, we want to assign the value that gets emitted to level within our levels manager. So this is you basically saying that you want to basically store any values that are emitted to this level inside of here. So what we're going to do is just run this and see what happens. Cool. And as you can see, we just look at the console, you basically can see that all the levels from 0 to 100 are being printed out in the console, which is pretty sick. So this is just an example of me just basically showing you how you can actually like bind, other values to a publisher. So whenever it subscribes to the publisher, it changes. But it's also worth noting that before we carry on into the next part, that this assign to isn't actually always the best way of actually, binding values to other, objects, because it can cause memory leaks. So in this case, it's fine. But in the next, well, not the next chapter, but in the future chapters, we'll actually talk about how we can basically avoid retain cycles with assign to. Now, the next thing I want you to do is I basically want you to go to the view controller file. I basically just want you to just run this so we can see the app. So as you can see in this example in our view controller, we basically have a view here with a text field and a label. So what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to basically see how we can actually bind a text field to an actual label. So when we type in here, this will automatically get updated. So the first thing that we're going to do in our view controller is, as usual, is import combine. Now this time we're actually going to basically create a set of cancellables to hold our subscriptions, and I'll explain later on why we need to do that. So the reason why we need to actually create this set of subscriptions is because we want to bind this text field to our subscription. So like I said before, it'll basically keep the subscription alive as long as the view controller is alive. But if we want to bind multiple text fields, we can actually, just assign them to the set so they all live within this collection of any cancellables. So once this is disposed of, all those subscriptions will be killed within this set. So the next thing we want to do is we actually want to basically create a subscription for our text field and then assign that to our label so it automatically listens to updates. So below the setup function, we're just going to basically create a function called setup subscriptions. And then what I want you to do is I basically want you to just call this function below the setup function here. And then within this function setup subscriptions, what we're going to do is we're actually going to type out some code to actually do what I said previously. So we'll type out and then break it down. All right, cool. So what we're basically saying here is we're basically using the notification center. And if you've never worked with this before, essentially this is just like a framework in iOS development that allows you to basically send updates. You can basically push a event or a notification and actually listen to when it's been sent. And then we basically just get the default notification center within the system, and we basically get a publisher for it. So what this essentially is saying here is we basically want to listen to the text did change notification on our text field. So our text field is called input text field. So whenever there's a change within the text for our text field, this is basically going to fire essentially. So what we're then going to do is we're basically going to get the text value out of our text field. So that's why we basically have to cast it as a UI text field and then access the property text. And this will basically, because it's compact mapped, it will basically remove any nils from that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to basically flatten the value from the text of our text field into a string here. I've actually got entered wrong. Flatten entered. Yeah, entered. Forgot how you spell entered. So what we're going to do is we're going to flatten that string here. And then this bit here is really interesting. So what we're basically saying here is that when we flatten the string, we're basically going to assign the value to our text label. So this label here on the text property of the label. So notice how on the key path, when you assign it on the object, you can access any property that you want. So in our case here, we're accessing the text property on our label and assigning this value into here. And then we simply store our subscriptions, store our publisher into the subscriptions here. Now, what this symbol is here is essentially, it basically means that this property here is a in and out property. So in and out basically means that you can pass a value into the function, and when you pass a value into the function, you can actually change the value as well. So this bit here is essentially what will basically help us manage our subscriptions and dispose of it when it needs to be disposed of. So it basically changes the collection of subscriptions when it needs to. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to stop this and we're just going to basically run this piece of code here. And now if I go into the text field and just type in something like hello, you can now see that the value that I'm actually typing in is updating automatically within the label, which is pretty cool. So just by writing these few lines of code here with, chaining these functions, you can basically bind a text field to a label fairly easily. All right, cool. So now the next thing that I want to do is I basically want to look at essentially some type of publishers. Now, the first publisher we're going to look at is something called a current value subject. So with current value subjects, essentially what it allows you to do is it basically allows you to hold a value within a publisher, and essentially allows you to observe that value so you can get the current value, and as well you can basically change the value as well. So this is really useful when you want to basically like emit a new value and observe changes over time. So a good example of where this would be useful would be like in a form, for example, because obviously when people are typing in a form, they can always change any text field at any moment. So what we're actually going to do here is we're actually going to basically simulate that. So we basically got a basic form here where someone can type in their first name, last name, and their occupation. What we're going to do is we're going to basically collect the values that someone typed it in, and we're going to do some very basic form validation. So if the form is valid, then print it out into the console, and if it isn't valid, then we'll show some kind of error message to let them know that, hey, you done messed up. So let's do that now. So as usual, first thing we need to do in our project is import combine. Okay, cool. And then what we're basically going to do here is just below all our UI, we're basically going to create our current subject value, and I'm actually going to break down the syntax for you. So just bear with me a second. All right, cool. So now let's break this down. So as you can see, we got our current value subject here, and we basically can declare the value that we basically want to, observe and change. And we basically can also define whether there's an error or not. So in this case, we have defined that there's an error rather than using the never type. So we basically have to give our current subject value a default type. So sorry. They basically have to give our current value subject a default value because this is what we're going to change and observe over time. And in our case, we're basically just giving it a person object with a first name and last name. Now, this is something that doesn't come with Swift. It's something that I provided for you. So we just check out this model. Essentially, this is just a person with these properties. And as you can see, I basically created an extension as well. So we can basically print out a message and also check to see if this person is valid. So they filled out all the correct details. All right, cool. So the next thing that we're going to do is basically create our subscription. So let's do that now. All right, cool. And now what we need to do is we actually need to bind each one of these text fields to each one of these properties within our struct. So what we're going to do below the setup is we're basically going to what we're going to do now is we're basically going to create a function to basically handle that specific case. And we're basically going to create a new function called setup input subscriptions to listen to all three text fields. So let's just do that now. All right, cool. So now before we actually carry on and do the rest of the text fields, I just wanted to kind of just break this down so we can actually, just discuss it. So it's similar to the last section where we basically bound our text field to a label, but there is a small difference. So up until the compact map, and where we basically convert and get the text value from our text field, rather than us using a sign, now we use sync. Now, the reason why we're using sync is you might spot that I'm using weak self here. Now, the reason why I'm using weak self here is because I don't want there to be a retain cycle with using assign to. So using weak self will basically make sure that this gets disposed of and we don't have any strong references within this view controller. Now, on the next line, you can see here that we're actually assigning it to the person. So our person above here, we're basically accessing the value, which is basically our default value here, and changing the first name. So we're basically assigning the value from the text field to our first name. Now, what's going to happen here essentially is that this is actually going to automatically update our value here. And if we wanted to as well, we can actually subscribe to the changes on person and actually listen and output that as well. All right, cool. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to basically type out the rest of this for each text field. So I'm just going to do that now. All right, cool. And as you can see, we're now signing up for each text field. So in the last name text field here, we're going to change the last name, and occupation, we're going to change the occupation. And we need to actually use this function within our load view. Let's do that. Now what we need to do is, because we're actually changing this person every single time these text fields are changing, we need to basically create a, subscription to basically listen to the changes that we're making to the person. So below your setup input subscriptions, let's create a new function. I'm just going to call this setup person subscription. And what we're going to do in this subscription here essentially is we're just going to basically listen to the changes that get made to that person. So let's do that now. Cool. So what we're basically doing here now is we're basically listening to the changes that get made to this person. So this here, this sync is basically going to get the most recent value from our person. And we're basically going to print that out in the console and store this subscription alongside our other subscriptions in our set. So now what we need to do is we need to actually call this person subscriptions after our input subscriptions. So let's just add it here. All right, cool. And it's worth noting the reason why I'm using load view. So the reason why you probably don't want to do this in like view will appear and whatnot is because we essentially just want this to get set up instantly. And also, if you set this up in view will appear, essentially what's going to happen is every single time the view appears, you're going to keep on creating these subscriptions, which you probably don't want to do. Now, let's just stop this and I'm just going to run this. All right, cool. So instantly, as you can see here, it's automatically emitting our default value to the console here with the value received. So now let's just type in our first name. And as you can see, as we type our first name, it prints it out. But essentially, you can see here I was printing out the first name as that changes in the person. And if I just do my last name, you can see there. And if I do my occupation, cool. So you can see now that we're able to actually emit changes and observe the changes to our current value subject. So this is really useful when you want to basically, like I said before, observe changes and also send events to it as well. Now, the next thing we want to do is when someone taps the confirm button, I actually want to combine all of this together and basically print out a message in the console to say, hey, this is the information that someone has entered, and if any of these are empty, I want to handle any of those errors as well. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is in our button, if you just scroll up here, we basically have a confirm did touch. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type out a bit of code and then break it down for you. Okay, cool. So what we're basically saying here that if our form is valid, then what we're going to basically do is we're basically going to send a completion to basically tell our subscription that we're done, or else we're just going to show an error message on the screen. So what we're going to do down below here now is essentially we're just going to basically listen to the finished, and when it's finished, we're going to basically just print out the value. So in here, what we're going to do is make a few changes. All right, cool. So we're basically saying here that when we basically get completion and it's finished, and we're just going to say this was the final input, and we're going to basically get the message. Now, because this is optional, we have to give it a default value if it's ever nil, which just could be an empty string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this now. And now if we hit this, you'll see that we get our form is invalid because it's not valid in our via our extension. And if I just fill out this information now, you'll see that it's updating. So now if I hit confirm, because it's now valid, this is our final input, and now the subscription stream has finished and it's been closed. All right, cool. So it's really important that when you finish with a subscription, you tell it that you're finished with it, so you don't just have it just chilling in memory. So when you're done with it, just say you're done with it. And the next publisher we're going to look at is PassthroughSubjects, and essentially this is similar to CurrentValue but it's a bit different. So, like I said before, how we have CurrentValue we also have something called PassthroughSubject. Now, there are differences. So, with CurrentValue you can basically emit and observe the value as it changes over time. PassthroughSubject is a bit different because essentially all it does is it just basically emits a value. So you can't actually observe and change any changes. It just basically just sends a new value. So what we're going to basically do is we're basically going to build a view controller where if you basically enter some bad words at least 3 times, it'll basically give us some sort of warning. And we're basically going to see how we can actually use PassthroughSubject alongside CurrentValue and see how the two are different and how you can basically combine them together within your code. So as you can see here, when I run the PassthroughSubject project, we just have a text field and a comment button here. And in the folder PassthroughSubjects in the Xcode project, we actually need to create a view model for managing the comments that people make. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a new folder here called view model. And within this folder, we're going to basically create our comments view model. So I'm just going to type out some code and then break it down. All right, cool. So now let's just break this down. So we basically define a final class here. Reason why we use final is because we don't want this class to be able to be subclassed. And if we look at the syntax for PassthroughSubject, it's very similar to CurrentValue except if you notice, we actually don't give it a default value. And like I said previously before, that's because you don't observe any changes to its current value. You just use this to emit events. So the type that we're going to basically be emitting and publishing is type string. And you can see here that it never fails, so which is why we put never. And all we have here is a function called send. And then we basically use the send function for the PassthroughSubject to basically emit that and publish the comment that someone has entered in the text field. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're basically going to create a subscription within this view model so we can basically see how PassthroughSubject works and how we don't observe the changes, we just listen to the events that are sent. So I'm going to do a bit more typing. All right, cool. So let's just break this down. So we basically created our subscriptions and obviously it's been marked as private, so it's only within this class. We have our initializer for this view model. So whenever we initialize this class, we're going to set up our subscriptions. And within our set of subscriptions, we're basically just going to observe and basically grab the value when it's published via sync and just basically print that out into the console so we can just see the new comment. So what we want to do now is we want to basically use this view model within our view controller so we can actually start sending some comments and seeing it in the console. So within the view controller, let's just initialize that class here. And the next thing we want to do is in our comment they touch, whenever someone taps this button, we just want to basically print out whatever's in the text field. So let's use that send function now. All right, cool. So you can see we're just basically just passing in the text views text property and not just print it out. So now let's just stop and run this. So now if I just type in here, hello, you can now see that our subscription's been set up and it's basically outputting that out into, when I make it bigger, it's actually outputting it now into the console. So if I just say, world, you can see how it prints that out. All right, cool. Well, what I want to do is I want to do some validation on this because if I just basically leave this empty now, you can see that it can work. So what we want to do is we basically want to do our validation for our empty state first, and then we're going to see how to handle the bad words. So let's just filter out whenever this is basically empty and it won't put it into the console. All right, cool. So essentially what we're saying here is if it's not empty, then it can carry on and it can actually get the value and print it out into the console. But if this is empty, then this will actually not print it out into the console. So let's just stop that and try that out now. All right, cool. So I'm just gonna type in here, hello. You can see it prints out hello. And if I delete all the text, I just enter, you can see that nothing when I'm tapping the button is actually being printed out to the console. All right, sweet. So now that we've handled the empty state, what we need to do is we actually need to handle if someone types in some bad words. So at the top of your comments view model, we're basically just going to create an array of bad words. Cool. And now what we're going to do is we're just basically just going to write out the implementation for checking whether that actually is a bad word or not. So let's do that now. So what we're basically doing here is we're basically checking to see if the array bad words contains the text that someone's typed in. And if someone does enter a bad word, what we want to do is we basically want to give the person 3 strikes. So if they basically enter in the bad word 3 times, then what we're going to do is we're basically going to block their account. So we're going to basically like simulate blocking someone's account. So in order to do this, we're going to need to basically create a new view model called account view model. So let's do that now. So in the view model folder, if you just create that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a bit of typing and then we'll break down as usual. All right, cool. So we basically have our class here, account view model, and essentially in this class, we basically have 2 states that an account could possibly be in. So an account could basically be either active or banned. So I don't think I need to break that down. So we basically also have a warning limit. So this is the 3 strikes that I was talking about. So this is the limit that you're basically allowed to basically post a bad word. And then essentially what we have here is we basically have 2 current value subjects. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically see how this is different from we're going to see how this is different from pass-through-subjects by seeing how we can actually observe the value as it changes rather than just emit an event. And within this one, we basically have a user's account status. So this is so we can observe the change in the user's account status. So right now, by default, it's active. And this is the warnings current value subject where we basically observe the number of warnings we've given someone, and by default you can see here that it's also 0 as well. So we're basically almost like starting them both off from a default state, and we basically have our set of cancellables where we'll basically store our subscriptions. All right, cool. The next thing that we need to do is we actually need to basically write a function that actually increases the user's warning. So whenever someone does something like Fugazi, then we'll actually basically increase the warnings. So let's do that now. Different to the pass-through subject because we're actually able to access the value of this and increment it by 1. And what we're going to do here is we're going to basically print out the warning in here. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to observe our warnings, and essentially what we're going to do is when it reaches a certain amount, we're going to basically change the user account status. So let's do that now. Right, cool. So let's break that down. So what we've done here is we basically created our subscription here and we basically use it whenever this class is initialized. So within our subscription, we're basically checking our warnings and we're basically filtering out value. So we're basically using weak self because, like I said before, we don't want to create a weak, a strong reference, like a retain cycle. And what we're basically saying here is that if the value is greater than or equal to the warnings that we basically set, so the warning limit, which is 3, then we want to essentially continue to basically sync and get that value out if we need it. So if this is actually less than 3, the value in warnings, then it actually will not hit and execute this. But if it is greater than or equal to 3, what we're going to basically do is again use weak self again. And we're basically going to change our user's account status value to banned. So the users actually could be banned from using this app. So what we're going to basically do now is we need to actually see how we can actually tie our account view model to our comments view model. And in order to do that, we're going to use some dependency injection. So we're essentially going to need to inject our account view model into our comments view model. So let's do that now. Cool. So as you can see in our comments view model, we basically defined our account view model, and we're actually going to inject it via the initializer and then set it up. So now what we need to do is where we basically put the comment to handle bad words. If someone's actually entered a bad word in, what we want to do here is rather than having this comment, we actually want to use our account view model to increase the warning. So let's do that. All right, cool. And then now what we finally need to do, and then now what we finally need to do is essentially we need to actually handle the account status being changed in our view controller. So let's handle that now. So the first thing that we need to do is where we declared our comments view model, we're actually going to change the syntax for this and actually use our account view model as well. So the first thing we want to do is, I'm just going to type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So you may have clocked that I changed the comments view model from being a constant to a lazy var, so a lazy computer property. Well, not pause. So I've changed it from a lazy initialization. Now there is a reason for that. So the reason why I've done that is so we can actually inject our account view model globally at runtime. And what's basically going to happen now is because we define these two as lazy vars, they're only going to be initialized when we actually use them. Now these two do get used, well, the comments view model gets used when you send a comment, but the account view model will get used when we actually, load up our view and set up the subscription to listen to the account status changing. So that's how we're able to inject it into our manager like this. If you just do this, it won't work because it's not lazily created, so you'll get an error like that. So make sure that you mark them as lazy. So now what we want to do is we want to basically listen and subscribe to the changes for our account view model. So just below the setup function, I'm going to create a new function to basically listen to that subscription. And then we're going to use this function here underneath the setup. And then within our function, I'm going to do a bit of typing out and then as usual, break it down. Cool. So now the first thing to note is that we have to create our subscription at the top because we want to, subscribe and listen to these changes. So make sure you define a set of any cancelable below the view models. And then if you just go down below in our function now, what we're basically doing here is in our account view model, we're basically going to get the user's account status that we defined, so the constant, and then we're basically going to sync. So we're basically going to listen to the changes in this constant and then basically get the status. We're using weak self again, so we don't have to, we don't have any retain cycles. And if the status has changed and it's now banned, then we're going to show an alert. So this show blocked is a custom function that I wrote in an extension on the view controller. So we're going to show the band, and then we're just going to store that in our subscription, so our set of subscriptions. So it's very important as well to note that the user account status, the reason why I create this as a constant is because I don't want someone to be able to change either this or this from outside of this class. So I kind of want to protect them. So that's why they're constants. You can't really change them like willy-nilly. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to test this out and see how this works. So I'm just going to run this. I'm just going to put some comments in. You can see here it's working fine, so great video. All right, cool. So now if I put in nothing and hit enter, you can see that nothing gets printed. Now let's test out how it handles these bad words. So if you just go back to our array, the first bad word that we have is the poop emoji. So I'm just going to paste that in and then hit comment. So now we've hit our first warning. And now I'm going to copy the aubergine, the eggplant emoji, because someone's been getting a bit excited. And then paste that in. And then now we're on our second warning. And now if I just if I comment this again, you'll see now that we hit our third warning and now our account is blocked. And you can see the message here. You thought you were tough, right? Well, guess what? You're banned. So don't be messing around. So as you can see here, you can see how powerful it is to basically combine pass-through subjects with current value subjects, where you can use the pass-through subjects to basically emit values and events, and use a current value subject to basically listen to those changes and basically update your UI. So these two are actually, we'll go look at is multi-threading. So what is let's say multi-threading. What is multi-threading? So essentially, multi-threading is when you basically want to move processes onto different threads. So imagine you basically have like a motorway. So rather than having one lane on a motorway, there's 3 different motorways, and that allows each car to basically move through the motorway quicker. So essentially, in programming or in iOS development in general, you can basically use multi-threading to basically offset heavy tasks onto a separate thread. Now, why would you want to do that? So let's say, for example, if you were downloading an image or you were calling an API, you don't want to block the UI. So you don't want to block someone from using the app just so you can download an image or call an API service. So by you moving the task onto a background thread, you basically allow the user to keep on using your app as normal. And then when that process is finished, you can then basically update the UI based on the response. So if you look at our example here, we basically have a box where we're going to download an image. And when we download the image, we're essentially going to just show that on the UI. So we're not going to block the main thread. We're just going to basically download the image on a background thread and then update it on the main thread. So we're going to see what image we're going to get here. So I'm going to surprise you. So what we need to do now, create our view model to basically handle downloading this image. So if you go into the multi-threading target and project, let's create a new folder. Let's create a new folder called view models. And then within this, we're going to basically create our image downloader view model. All right, cool. So as you can see here, because we're working with images, we're basically going to import UIKit and combine, of course. But what I've actually done here is I've actually basically used a pass-through subject rather than a current value subject. And the reason why it's a pass-through subject is because I basically just want this constant here to basically emit and tell me when there's a new image. So I don't want it to observe it. I just want it to just send an image. So this is where you have to start thinking about which one it is you want to use, because we just want this to essentially act as an event to basically give us a new image. So we basically have an optional UI image, and there's not going to be an error, so it's never. And we've got our subscriptions to hold any subscriptions that we want to basically handle. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically type out the function to basically download the image. So I'm going to type this out because it's quite long, and then we'll basically break down what each step is doing. All right, cool. So let's break this down. So essentially, we're going to use URL session. So if you've never come across this before, URL session is essentially what you use to basically like download from some sort of service. So we're basically going to access the URL session shared. And URL session now comes with this data task publisher, which is what you can use with Combine. Now, by default, it's interesting. So by default, URL session is on the background thread. So you don't actually need to subscribe to it on the background thread. But the reason why we're subscribing to it on the background thread here is because we want to just see how it handles events. So I just want to basically handle the subscriptions myself. So this handle events, I think it actually puts it back onto the main thread. So that's why I'm forcing it onto the background thread here. So in handle events, so when this starts and it receives a subscription, so when we subscribe to this, what's going to happen is it's basically going to print out for me whether this is on the main thread or not. And when we basically receive a new value, it's going to tell me if it's on the main thread or not. And when it finally just finishes and the whole subscription has completed, it's going to do the exact same thing. So the next thing we need to do now is essentially we need to actually use this function within our view model to see how it handles it when we try to download an image and see what thread it puts it on. So let's do that now. So in our view controller, let's just use our view model. Cool. And then when someone taps the button, we're going to pass in this image link to basically see how it handles the threads. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do now is just run this and then tap that button to see what happens. So as you can see, it starts a subscription on the main, it starts it on the main thread, which is false, so it's not on the main thread. And when it receives and it finishes, it's not on the main thread either. So the entire work has been done on the background thread. So we're not actually blocking our UI here. We're actually doing work in the background. All right, cool. So what I actually want to do now is when someone taps on this button, I actually want to set this image to a placeholder in the meantime. So the user sees some sort of placeholder image, and then when the service comes back with a result, we want to update this with the actual image from the service. Now, if we just go back into our image downloader view model, what we want to do here is in our handle events, just below the starting subscriptions, I actually want to set the placeholder image on the main thread. Now, when you're working with UI, 9 times out of 10, you want to do all your UI work on the main thread. So let me type this out and then break it down for you. All right, cool. So what we're basically saying here is we're basically accessing the system's main thread here ourselves manually, and then we're basically going to force, well, not force, but we're basically going to send an UI image so we can basically, get that image and set it to our image view, which is what we'll do in a second. But we're basically setting it to our placeholder. So this UI image is actually something that I've added into the project for you. So if you go into the assets folder, you'll see this placeholder image here. So this is something that I've added. And what this is going to do is this is actually going to call this function on the main thread. So just so we can see that, I'm going to put a message here to basically say setting So now we can see whether the placeholder is being set on the main thread. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to actually assign our image to our image view in our view controller. So let's do that now. So in our view controller, below our setup function, let's create a new function called setup image subscription. Cool. And then what we want to do is we want to call this function after our load view. Cool. So inside of here, what we need to do is essentially we need to actually create a subscription to hold this inside of. So let's do that at the top here. Right, cool. And then we need to assign this, we need to store our image view subscription in here. So let's just type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So similar to the previous chapter before, where we bound our text field to our label, what we're doing here is we're actually binding the image that gets published from our pass-through subject to our image views image property. So you can see here how we're accessing the image property using the keypath syntax, and then we store that subscription within our subscription set. So what we're going to do now is we're going to run the app and actually see if this actually sets our placeholder. So let's do that now. So now when you tap the button, you can see that it actually does set it to the placeholder. And if you just look at our messages here, we do get to see that the placeholder is actually being set on the main thread, which is exactly what we want. All right, cool. So now the next step that we need to actually do is we actually need to download this image from our URL and actually push it back to our image view and put that on the main thread as well. So in order to do that, we're going to use a higher order function called receive on, which comes with combine. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to receive events on a certain thread. So I'm going to type this out and then break it down. Right, cool. So let's break this down. So after we handle our events for our placeholder, what we're basically doing now is we're actually getting the data that we got back from our service call. And we're basically going to turn it into a UI image. So this is going to be an optional UI image. And then what we're going to do is we're going to receive any events after this on the main thread. So this sync is actually going to be handled on the main thread. So if when it completes, we're just going to print out this message. But when we receive this value, we're going to basically push it. So we're going to basically emit it using our pass-through subject. So our image view gets updated. And then we're going to basically also tell our current image subscription that, you know, you're finished, you completed. So we don't actually need this subscription anymore. So we're basically just going to say you're done. So now let's run this and see what happens. And let's see what picture that we get. So if we just run this again now. And then let's just tap this button, download. Cool. And as you can see, we get my man Craig in it. So essentially, if we look at the logs, let's just look at the logs and let's just basically like explore this a bit. So you can see here that when we receive our image, it's on the main thread, which is what we want. And also as well, when it finishes the subscription, it's also finished on the main thread as well. So we get exactly what we want here. We run our task on the background so we don't block the UI, and then we basically receive our image once everything's completed, all the processing's completed, back onto the main thread to update our UI. So it's like a seamless, smooth experience. And we also get my man Craig looking at the M1 MacBooks. So it's a win-win for everyone. But it's really important that you know, focus on these topics because it's pretty important to iOS development. Now, the next topic we're going to look at is memory management. So we're actually going to see how important it is and how to basically make sure that we don't create retain cycles using combine. So, all right, cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to see how to handle memory management in combine. So if you just open up memory management, the project here and the playground, you should see a class here. So account view model, and this account view model essentially has a account state. So a enum for the account state, a struct here for the account with the username and their status. We have a current value subject here, so we can observe the changes to a user and also, you know, publish new changes as well. And we basically also have a enum here, so account state, which actually tells us the user's current account state as well. So what we're basically saying here is whenever we change the users, whenever we basically change the user status property here, we want to also assign that new status from here into our private variable as well. So we're saying that we want to store the state on self being this view model, and it's going to be stored in their subscriptions. And when we don't need this class anymore and it gets deinitialized, we're going to print out this message here. So let's see how we can actually create our view model and actually see how to deinitialize it. So I'm just going to type it out. All right, cool. So what we basically got here is we basically got a variable for our view model. It's an optional account view model. The reason why it's optional is so I can dispose of it myself and basically deinitialize the class. What we're going to do here is we're going to basically change the user's status to inactive, and then that should update this account state because we've actually assigned and bound our account state to any changes that happens on the user status. So what I'm going to do is just run this now and see what happens. So as you can see now, it basically when we change it to inactive, it basically prints out that the user status has changed to inactive. All right, cool. So the next thing I want to do is I want to actually deinitialize this object. So I want to dispose of it because I don't need it anymore. So let's do that now. So if I set this to nil, realistically, this deinitialize, we want it to execute. So let's do that now. Ooh. So as you can see, we've executed all this code, but our view model does not get deinitialized. Now, the reason why that is because we basically define self here. So because we defined that we want to basically assign our value from our status, so any changes to our status to our account state on self, which is this view model, what we've essentially done here now is we basically created a retain cycle, because when you define self here like this, you basically create a strong reference between your subscription and your view model, so there's no way to dispose of it. So in order to basically fix this, rather than using assign to on self, we're going to basically use sync like we've been using previously before. So let's change this from assign to sync. And what we're going to do here is we're basically going to use weak self. So what we're going to do here is we're going to basically just make sure that we just basically set our account state to our value. All right, cool. So now, by us using sync rather than assign to, we've actually removed our memory leak, so our retain cycle. So when you're working with view models and you want to assign a value to another value like this, 9 times out of 10, I will just go with sync rather than assign to, so you don't get any retain cycles. So now let's run all this and see what happens. And as you can see now, because we're not creating a stronger reference type within our view model, we're able to easily deinitialize it and release our view model when we set it to nil. So like I said before, just try to stick to sync unless you know 100% that assign to will not create a retain cycle. All right, so the next example we're going to look at is how we can actually work with combine in SwiftUI. So with SwiftUI, you basically get some publishers without combine and some subscriptions. So you basically get values that you can change and also listen to their values changing. So what I'm going to do is basically go to the project handling publishers in SwiftUI, and in the views folder, open up the contacts view. And then essentially what I want you to do is just basically change the target to be the same name. So if we just run the simulator in SwiftUI here, if I actually tap the plus button here, you'll see that essentially a screen pops up from the bottom. And if we tap cancel, it dismisses. Now, what is actually handling presenting that screen? So in our contacts view, we basically have a private variable called isPresented, but we've actually annotated with the type called @state. So @state is actually part of SwiftUI, and essentially what that allows you to do is it basically allows you to observe the state and also make changes to it. So what we're basically doing, if we just scroll down below, is when someone taps the add button, we're basically changing isPresented to true, and we're observing it in our sheet as to whether it should be presented or not. So this property here in the this parameter here in isPresented for our sheet is basically checking to see if this is true, and if it is true, then it's basically going to present our content, so our view from the bottom. You can see how SwiftUI already has some principles that are similar to combine in terms of listening to values and changing them, because this is no different to basically a current subject value, right? So what we actually want to do on our contact screen is we essentially want to basically allow someone to enter in some information, and when they hit add, we want to basically update our list of contacts accordingly. What we're going to do is in combine, we're basically going to use something called an observable object, and we're going to use a published property wrapper. Now the published property is part of SwiftUI, but we'll break that down after I finish typing this out. So in here, let's create a new folder called view model. And then let's create a new Swift file called contacts view model. And then what we're going to do is just import combine, and then I'll type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So let's just break this down. So what we basically have is we have a class here called contacts view model, which I marked final. And then we basically got this new class that you may not have saw before. So this is called an observable object. So essentially what we're basically doing here with this class, which comes with combine, is we're essentially going to say that we want to observe the changes that happen to this view model. And within this view model as well, we're basically going to use the @published property wrapper here, which basically allows us to basically publish events. Publish basically allows us to basically, publish changes within our observable object, and also subscribe and listen to them as well. So again, this is no different to using a current value subject. So we mark this as private set because I only want to allow someone to change this array of contacts within this class. So I don't want to basically allow someone to change it from outside. So you can only access it and observe it from outside, but within this class, you could basically listen to it and change it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to use this view model within our contacts view and basically see how we can actually use publish to basically switch between two different views. So let's go to our contents view, and then I'm just going to basically type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So what we basically specified here is an observed object. So because we marked our class as an observable object, we're basically saying here that we want to observe the changes to our view model. Now, you could use state object here if you wanted to, but the reason why I'm using observed object is because I want to basically observe this view model within multiple views. So that's why I'm using it in this case rather than using state object. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the view model's published property for the array to basically switch between showing that there's no contacts on the screen and our list of contacts. So I'm just going to type this out now. All right, cool. So now let's just break this down. So what we're basically saying here is that if the view model contacts is empty, so if our published, we're basically checking our published array of contacts. If that array is empty, we're basically going to show this content here, so the no contacts. And if it isn't empty, so we actually have some values in the array, we're basically going to create a lazy grid of items to show our list of contacts view. So what we actually need to do now is we need to basically actually handle adding in our contacts via this add new contact screen now. So what we need to do is in our add contacts view, we need to actually inject our observed object into our as content view. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. And once we do that, we should get some errors. So the first error we should get is down here. So all we need to do is just fix this by just basically injecting our view model. And then we should get another error at the root of our contacts view. And now what we need to do here is we need to actually pass through our view model here. So let's do that now. Now that we're passing our contacts view model into our add contacts view, essentially what's going to happen is that the state of our view model, so the published array, is going to be maintained between different views. So essentially what we're doing here is we're essentially passing data between views. So if you make a change within the add contacts view, it will automatically update within the main contacts view as well. So what we want to do now is actually do that change. So inside of add contacts view, what we want to do in order to update our array is we basically want to bind our contact that someone's filled in and actually add it to the array. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually bind our new contact to our text fields. So as you can see here, we've got our new contact here, which is a state variable. So this is the new contact when someone wants to fill it in. And we're basically binding each property within the contact struct to our text fields. So it basically automatically updates it. So within our contact view model, we need to basically create a new function that actually adds our contact into this array. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So this function simply just adds a new contact into this. So once this changes, it will actually update our view previously before, which is our contacts view. So now in our add contacts view, when someone taps the add button, what we want to do is we now want to call that function. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now that we've done that, let's actually review how this works in SwiftUI and how by using just simply published and observed objects. So I'm just going to pin this. So by simply just using observable objects and publish, we can easily pass data between our views and observe changes to them. If I hit the plus button here, We're now going to basically get this new screen where we can add a new contact. So I'm just going to fill out some information. And as you can see now, we've actually basically got our item in our list. So we basically got our list of items showing up. So because our contacts array isn't empty anymore, it's now automatically observed that change, and it's basically redrawn the view, and it's now showing our list of items. So you can see here how SwiftUI is really good with listening to changes, and it's very, very easy to basically observe changes as well. So this is a really simple example. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to move on to the next section and actually see how we can actually create our own publishers from scratch and actually see how we can handle this in Swift. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So what we're going to do now essentially is we're going to actually look at how we can actually build our own publishers. So if you just open up the any publishers just in Never, and if we just switch to that as well, so what we're going to do is we're basically going to create a function which basically has its own publisher, and we can observe the value that we get back from this API request here. So the first thing we need to do is just type out the signature. So let me just type this out and then break it down for you. All right, cool. So we've basically got this function here, but if you look at the return type, it says any publisher. So basically, any publisher is essentially just a way of just creating a generic publisher in general. And we basically define that we want it to basically return an array of posts. So this is the, when it's finished and successful, give us an array of posts. And if it ever fails, the error is going to be never. So it's never going to fail. So what we're actually going to do is when this API request fails, we're basically going to essentially just return an array of empty posts. So what we need to do now is actually need to type out the code to call the network and then decode these posts and then give us the response back to basically have our post. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So let's break this down. So essentially what we've done here is we basically created a URL session like we did in the previous chapter where we basically downloaded an image from the internet. And then the next thing that we're basically doing is we're basically going to call the service, so using our URL to get our posts, and we're going to map the data from our service, so basically convert into data. And we're going to basically use this higher order function here called decode. So what this decode function here is doing is it basically gets the data and decodes it to an array of posts using a JSON decoder. So it's basically turning the JSON from a service into an array of posts. Now, if this fails, what we're going to do is we're basically going to catch any errors and just return an array of empty posts. So this just here is just going to give us an empty array of posts. So because we define never here, we're just going to basically just have an empty array of posts. And it's very, very important that you use this erase to any publisher. So essentially what this does is it basically allows you to basically turn this publisher into like a generic publisher, because the signature from this publisher is not going to match this. So what this basically does, it allows you to basically just convert into like an any publisher, so you can just return any type of publisher. And then finally what we do is we just return at the end here. So now what we need to do, that we've got our own custom publisher, is actually subscribe and actually listen to the value that we get back from the service. So let's do that now. Cool. So as you can see here, the syntax is very, very similar to what we've been using before. So essentially all we're doing here is we're just basically getting from our publisher, we're going to sync and just basically listen to the value that we receive from it. And then we're going to print out the post, and then we're going to store our publisher in our set of cancellables. So now let's run this and see what happens. So if I just run this now and then just check the console. Cool. You can now see that we basically get all the JSON back from the service, and this was successful because it was able to successfully call the service. So you can see all the information here. Cool. So as you can see, we're basically able to easily just call our service, and we're able to actually just create our own publisher here to essentially subscribe to events within our code. So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to take this a step further, and we're actually going to use something called future and deferred So it's not future like mask on, mask off future, but basically it's Swift future, which basically allows us to like take our, combine to the next level and create essentially our own API functions. So let's look at how we can do that. All right, cool. So, like I said in a previous chapter, essentially what we're going to do now is basically take our publishers and create our own publishers, but this time take it to the next level. So, what we basically have here is we basically have a screen in the featured and deferred. So, the featured and deferred Xcode project here. And what we're basically going to do is we're basically going to write our own custom publisher that essentially tells us when someone's either accepted or rejected, giving us access to their push notifications. So that's the whole point of this button. And then this status unknown is essentially going to observe that change. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically create our view model called notification view model and look at how we can use future and deferred to basically create our own combined API. So let's go into here and let's just create a new group called view model. And then we're going to create a new file called notification view model. All right, cool. So in our notification view model, what we're going to do is we're going to basically create a function that allows us to authorize a user using the user notifications framework. So let's type this out and then break it down. All right, cool. So let's break this down. So essentially what we've got here, we've got a function called authorize, which returns any publisher of type bool and error. And essentially we've got this new kind of like closures here called deferred and future. So what do these two do? So essentially what deferred actually does, it basically allows you to basically wait for the subscription to run before it actually allows the publisher to basically emit any values. So if we didn't have deferred here, when we call this function, our future would actually automatically, once this class is initialized, just trigger essentially. So this basically allows us to delay our actual publisher from emitting events until we actually need to. So what future allows us to do is essentially what I just said before, where it basically allows us to emit whether there's been a success or a failure. So in our case, on our publisher, we defined that it's possible to basically have a success of Boolean and it's possible to have a failure with an error. So our future is basically going to help us emit that success, which is either true or false, and also if there's a failure, it will emit the error. And then essentially what we do within our future is we basically call the UN users notification center. We get the current notification center and just basically request authorization from that within our app. So if there is an error, then we're basically going to get the error and then essentially push that through with our future handler. So push that event through with the error. And if there isn't an error, we're going to push through a success with the status of whether the notification has been granted or not. All right, cool. So what we need to do now is we need to actually see how we can actually use this code within our actual view controller. So we just go back to our view controller. Let's create an instance of it here and a subscription as well. All right, cool. So now what we want to do is essentially we want to actually see and subscribe to the event that gets emitted from our authorized publisher. So within the permission did touch, let's actually write out some code to do that and then we'll discuss it. All right, cool. So what we're basically doing here now is when someone taps our permission button, we're basically going to call the authorize function. And if we get an error from the authorization, publisher, rather than us showing an error on the screen for now, what we're just going to do is just replace the error with false. So whenever there's an error, we'll basically say publish false. Then what we're going to do is we want to receive everything onto the main thread. Now it's important that you do this because when you're actually granting, you're basically asking for permission to the user's notification. I'm pretty sure it runs on a background thread, and because we're going to update the UI, we want to make sure that we update the UI on the main thread. So that's why we're doing receive on the main thread. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sync and basically receive our value from our publisher and update our permission text label here. So if we basically do get our push notifications granted, this will basically say, you know, granted, and if we don't, we deny it, it will say denied. And then finally we store our publisher in our, you know, set of cancellables. So what we're going to do now is we're going to rerun this now and then see this in action. So we just run it. So if I tap ask for permission, you'll see that now it's actually asking me for permission. So it's executing our code for the UN user notifications to request authorization. And if I choose allow, you can now see that our label has now updated to granted. And if I just stop this and just run it again, so if I actually need to delete it to see this change. So if I just run it again from fresh, and if I tap the button again, I hit don't allow, you can now see the label says that we've been denied, which is exactly what we want. So you can see here how you can basically build your own like combined API using Deffered, Future, and any publisher, and you can essentially cut down a lot of code and keep your code nice and clean. Now, I want to give a little shout out to this tutorial in terms of like who inspired me for the Future and Deffered section, because I feel like, you know, you get inspiration from somewhere, you should always give them a bit of, you know, give them a bit of clout. So I want to basically give a big shout out to Majid, who basically has a great blog on working with SwiftUI and using Combine and whatnot. So I'll leave a link to his site in the description box below if you want to go and visit yourself. And I'd highly recommend you check it out and subscribe to his newsletter as well to basically get updates and just see how we tackle SwiftUI and Combine, because it's really nice and clean. So that's everything from me today in this video. If you have any feedback or other suggestions, please leave it below in the comment sections below. Also as well, I'd appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And also as well, if you're not already, subscribe to the channel to help the channel grow, and hit the notification button, updates whenever I release a new video. So that's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.